a questão essencial que precisa ser revisto é que no século XX, a cidade e a forma de viver foram construídas em torno do automóvel. O automóvel definiu a cidade e tanto a malha viária urbana como a malha interurbana. O modelo do século XX, que é o modelo americano, e impressionante que os Estados Unidos continuam a ser referência no imaginário, e se quer copiar o modelo americano, ele hoje é um modelo completamente anacrônico, fora do que nós deveríamos ter hoje. O grande desafio é como refazer as cidades, construindo o quê? Construindo espaços públicos de convivência pública, porque a definição, o que é cidade? Cidade é, basicamente, a ideia de pessoas de maior diversidade possível, onde se encontram e que é o estímulo à criatividade. Essa é a questão da cidade. Quando a cidade passa a ser, eu acho que São Paulo, nós temos no Brasil 2 exemplos extraordinários de cidades, dos erros sobre metrópoles. O primeiro, que eu acho fantástico, é Brasília, que é a concepção da cidade, cuja arquitetura é uma arquitetura segregacionista. Ela segrega as pessoas em vez de unir, baseada em torno do automóvel e de uma arquitetura que é essencialmente escultural e não uma arquitetura funcional, com uma percepção comunista de como viver, substituindo a criatividade, o caos natural que a cidade cresce por uma questão planejada, uma obsessão planejadora autoritária. A expressão qual é o nome dela? Janet Malcolm, o nome dela Jacobs. Janet Jacobs, que eu adoro, quando eu li no livro do Edward Glaser, sobre que ela se referiu ao Lincoln Center como tem um rigor mortis por construção, eu imediatamente lembrei de Brasília, uma cidade que tem rigor mortis por construção. O outro exemplo, que está no extremo oposto da questão das metrópoles equivocada, é São Paulo, no sentido que é uma cidade que cresceu da forma como devem crescer as cidades, que é com uma certa, pela sua vitalidade. É a vitalidade de São Paulo que fez que ela criasse um problema. Porque a gente precisa respeitar as duas coisas, a vitalidade, um certo caos, uma certa ação da cidade. Eu adoro a expressão de um livro da década de 70 de um professor da NYU, chamado Richard Sennett, que se chama The Uses of Disorder, sobre a questão das cidades. Quer dizer, a cidade precisa de uma certa desordem. Por isso é que eu acho a arquitetura do Tom Mayne espetacular, no sentido de uma certa criação, uma certa surpresa de interação, mas com uma certa desordem. Mas São Paulo é, evidentemente, uma cidade onde o seu sucesso, de uma forma baseado no automóvel, levou a uma situação onde ela se tornou a anticidade, de novo, porque você não se comunica, não tem espaços públicos, vive dentro de automóveis, só funciona no automóveis onde os engarrafamentos inviabilizam a vida urbana e cria em vez de ser uma ideia de interação, quase que o seu concidadão é seu inimigo e não alguém com quem você quer se comunicar. Nós precisamos, portanto, reverter isso de uma forma drástica. Nós estamos muito atrasados nisso. Então, a questão transcende a lei das licitações, se você me permite. É preciso algum movimento de guerrilha sobre isso. A primeira coisa nós precisamos definitivamente barrar o automóvel. O automóvel impede que a cidade se reconstrua. Eu acredito, inclusive, que nós não precisamos de tanto de planejamento. Se nós proibirmos o automóvel, tirarmos o automóvel, a cidade se reinventa. Agora, há tanto hábito imaginário no automóvel e tanto investimento já feito no automóvel, que isso não é fácil. Então, é preciso fazer isso por etapas, começar com uma espécie de guerrilhas de inserção de áreas, onde isso vai sendo revertido.
Acho que o Tom tem uma parte.
There are so many points. Let's start with Brasilia. It came up in an interview I did today. I couldn't disagree. I'm getting this. completely, totally disagree with you. As a Brazilian, I would be embarrassed for you to say that. That it's this is the most aggressive urban experiment in the 20th century for city making, and it's an experiment. It doesn't have to work in every way. It was the most unusual circumstance, the only time in the 20th century that an architect could operate at this scale and investigate the notion of a city. The idea is already, as a concept of even designing a city is a couple decades irrelevant today, of course. No one could think about it. We're in Sao Paulo, a city of 22 million in this metropolitan area. And I'll get to that later with Jane Jacobs. Senate, yes, huge influence on me. But it's something you should be absolutely proud of. Only Chandigarh with Corbusier, which is a government center, not a city, is the second experiment. And it was every architect, urban designer, planner would have to look at that precisely for the way it failed, if it fails. I've spent time there. I think it's actually an amazing place, and it has a beauty and an order that represents the 20th century, the only 20th century modern city that was planned as a willful event, right? Not a Los Angeles that came, or Sao Paulo that grew out of infrastructure, out of the automobile in the end of the 20th century. The Jane Jacobs, it couldn't be more irrelevant. He's talking about little towns. Nothing to do with Sao Paulo. 22 million people, the problem is you don't know what the problem is. No one has even got their arms around what it means as urban accumulation, aggregation has reached the scale of this city, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Mexico City, London, you could go on, that we don't even understand how to grapple with them, much less worrying about a Jane Jacobs, how everybody should be friendly and this whole kind of village kind of thing, and going, it's absurd to understand it within economic, social, cultural, infrastructural, urban, transportational, it goes on and on. It's this insanely complex thing. I liked your last image, the black, whatever that was, the black matter, because I was going to say those are all the pieces, the enormous amount of elements that go into the work today, and we can't even really grasp the elements, much less solve the problem. And we understand the implications of the problem, that the obsolescence of the automobile as an idea. So it had a lifespan of about 50 years, and it's done, and because it doesn't work anymore. But huge amount of it has to do, the problem still has to do with the scale of the aggregate. And it produces social problems, cultural problems, it goes on and on, right? And I think it's something we should be, there's just so little investigation, really. The other one in the beginning of the conversation was discussing architecture's role. And it seems as though that we as architects, when we make buildings, there's so much focus on the look that I think is so overemphasized. The question should be, how does it operate within this condition? So when I tried the best I could today in San Francisco, if you like it or don't like it, I made a joke about the Pelosi. She didn't like it, okay, but she is, it's social program, the idea of the workforce, the idea of the central space of the city, the idea of how it dealt with energy resources. Energy resources as architects, the last statistic I heard, transportation and architecture makes up 70% of the way we use resources. Architecture 40. So as architects, we have some responsibility and obligation, like we would in the medical community or the legal community or in a scientific community, that's just a constraint. It maybe leads to something, but it's just a constraint that we have that power. And with that, it seems like we can somehow shape behavior. We can change things in some way. And we can shape behavior related to a contemporary society. So I think, to me, very unlike Jane Jacobs, in a contemporary society, a majority of women are working. A lot of those women have children. We could go through all the statistical demographic information. So when we looked at San Francisco, we're just trying to make realignments that deal with a modern thing that keep up with that, right? It has to just be, that's all it has to do. It's just keep up with modern, contemporary notions of how we operate in the world. And they've changed a bit, not changed a bit, they've significantly changed in the last 50 years because this whole phenomena of Sao Paulo is a end of the 20th century issue and it's continuing, right? And I think we should be constantly alert for methods of investigating or be incredibly curious of like, how do we kind of solve this problem? Because nobody's doing it now. The political class, forget it, right? Business people are concentrated in their own private, they're a autonomous piece of the economic puzzle. And there seems to be, we're at a time in history where the private world has overpowered the public world. And it's just a cycle. And I think it's global today. And because we live in a global place. Oh, I had one more thing I was going to say too, regarding the architecture. And that we understand it in those terms, and that we're looking now for the implication of our personal acts as human beings, as drivers, as building single buildings, to the collective consequence of that. The other thing, I was going to ask you a question regarding the government and building important buildings, iconic buildings, quality buildings, intelligent buildings. What is it you could tell me in Brazil that's different than other cultures? When I work in China, there's two different things going on. One is symbolic, how they see themselves in the global world, and the other is pragmatic. It's just typical architecture, how things work and cost parameters and everything else, right? That's typical architecture. The first one's the key one. The clients I'm working for now, and I'm doing big projects there, the thing that is so different than working in the US is they have huge visions that are symbolic of building a building, which is it's the history of architecture for 4,000 years, which represents a symbol of a culture at a particular period of time. And so when I showed that little thing coming over that was, you could say it was extravagant because its use is conceptual, or its use is just for beauty. It has no function, which I think is also a really stupid idea. Could you live without music or dance or theater? I would say those are the most functional things alive, right? You can survive on very little real things, right? Food and things. And when he did that, it was part of a general mentality, just like the tall building, and I've got two more, about how they see themselves in the global environment as Chinese. And it's huge. They're going, no, we want to hire talent. We want to hire something that's going to be the complete represent the 21st century. They want to push the envelope. If clients ask me in the States, has it been done before? I know what the answer is. They want to say yes. If I said that in China, I'd lose the job. Of course it hasn't been done before. I'm doing it for you. This is a state-of-the-art thing, right? But anyway, that part of it is symbolic. And so I would think, going back to one of your early statements, the thing that would have to change or be nurtured would be the notion of how Brazilians see themselves in the global climate, because architecture is absolutely one of the symbols of you representing yourself, of this is where we are, and the relationship of architecture that's aggressive in terms of innovation, whether it be aesthetic or performance, would be one of the most likely symbolic manifestations. What do you think?
Eu vou ligar as duas questões. Não me surpreende que você tenha essa posição sobre Brasília. Aliás, porque Brasília, as duas razões que Brasília foram construídas, a primeira era, teoricamente, do ponto de vista militar, uma estupidez, um anacronismo. Era uma percepção de que era preciso tirar a capital da costa, do mar, que era muito fácil de exposição, e levá-la para o centro. Havia também uma razão de que levar o desenvolvimento, que no Brasil ficou sempre preso ao longo da linha do litoral, pela própria configuração da Serra do Mar, etc., e internalizar o desenvolvimento, que faz sentido e isso, inclusive, funcionou. E a terceira, e talvez mais importante, era simbólica. Então, era exatamente o que você disse. Mas era simbólica, e eu vou voltar à questão depois do simbólico. Mas, antes de tudo, se Brasília do ponto de vista de um sucesso, do ponto de vista arquitetônico e simbólico, sem dúvida nenhuma. Provavelmente, como você disse, é a única experiência de uma cidade integralmente planejada em torno da questão arquitetônica. Você não teve que viver e trabalhar em Brasília, você só visitou. Eu trabalhei em Brasília, aliás, eu tenho uma coisa familiar que meu avô, pai da minha mãe, foi quem construiu Brasília, foi o primeiro governador de Brasília, Israel Pinheiro. Então, se eu digo isso na minha família, eu levo mais puxão de orelha que você está me dando. Mas, de qualquer maneira, Brasília, do ponto de vista da concepção da vivência de uma cidade é um desastre. E qualquer pessoa te dirá isso. Qualquer pessoa. Do ponto de vista, inclusive, do isolamento do governo, de isolar o governo da sociedade e de isolar o governo de sentir de um governo democrático, também é um equívoco. Não se esqueça que a China é um país autoritário não democrático. E nós vamos ver ainda onde vai dar a China. Do ponto de vista, esta prioridade do simbólico é típico de sociedades autoritárias, de sociedades não democráticas.
But the symbol in China is capitalism, not
State capitalism.
Not
It's totally
communism.
different.
It's
Totally different.
capitalism.
It's state capitalism. In state capitalism.
Now we're going to dot I's and cross T's. Come on,
It's totally different. Well, since I'm speaking with you, I'm going to speak in English. Let me start in English. So it's completely different. And one of the consequences that we had with Brasilia is that there was no concern whatsoever of how to fund for the investment on constructing Brasilia. And we paid the price for 3 decades of extremely high inflation in Brazil. And that's the point that we're going to see what's going to happen in China. Because now they are financing on state credit. We're going to see how it's going to end. It has a long way to go, maybe, but it's one moment we're going to see how it's going to end. So the fact is that we need, architecture cannot be pure symbolism. Architecture cannot be pure arrogance, human arrogance. And I think it's exactly the moment that we should change. And architecture, exactly as everything else in the humanity, should be more humble. We should be a little bit more humble and stop pretending to show off that we need arrogance. When we were weak and we were really, we needed to survive and our survival was not guaranteed, the idea of showing up force and arrogance, the symbolism of arrogance, was very important. I think it has changed completely. And the world hadn't understood it. And I think that one of the things that we need is the conception of architecture as something that is much more towards community, the way to live together, and not arrogance and not authoritarian symbolism. So I totally disagree with you in terms of Brasilia.
But you don't think
and when I quoted Jane Jacobs, not about Brasilia, not about São Paulo, it was about Brasilia. Okay, of course not São Paulo. São Paulo has nothing to do with Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs, yes, she had a kind of romanticism in terms of Manhattan. But what I liked her expression of saying that there was a causa mortis built in the Lincoln Center. And I said, well, when I read that, I said, well, this goes perfectly to Brasilia, in my view.
Well, look, we're not going to agree on the Brasilia thing. And by the way, the location is not, you can be in Washington and be disconnected to the culture and be an hour and a half away from New York. And I'm not sure that geography makes a difference. And it's not uncommon that huge amount of centers of power are in areas outside of the commercial centers, and that's not unusual. I was asking you about, we were talking about your public architecture and the problem, whether it was corruption, whether it was the lowest common denominator. And I was responding that using the China example, that architecture in all cultures is symbolic of representing the culture, and the public architecture is the public. It represents who you are. And I was asking why that hasn't, or if it is, or where that status is in Brazil, because it would have to require, desire precedes reality. So first would come the desire for representing yourself in the world as contemporary and as innovative and as having some status. And again, it would be the role of architecture as one of the territories that represents that. Because without that, the conversation's over.